Hello and welcome to week 5 of our revision videos. This week we've had lots of prep for our assessments, starting to get towards our mocks for year 11s, and obviously if you're watching this you're probably revising for a test. So we started off in year 9 with social issues and the idea of problems stemming from our look at consensus sociology versus conflict sociology. So you had an online document where you combined different ideas around social issues for family, for education, etc., all on the Google Classroom. So what you should hopefully see is that you can apply social issues to all manner of topics in sociology. And we looked based on the exam spec of families, education, crime, class and identity. We also introduced Emil Durkheim to our sociology in year 9. So we looked at the fact he's a positive sociologist. He looks at the big picture. His two main areas of study that we talked about were his studies on suicide and his study on crime and deviance, and how he linked industrialization of Europe to higher rates of suicide. And he broke this down into 5 different categories or reasons, essentially 5 causes, that all revolved around traditional norms and values, traditional structures all breaking down, people losing their sense of identity and structure in society. And we talked about all the different reasons why Durkheim might have studied these and what it means to have a scientific approach in sociology. Our big question this week was whether crime is good for society or not. Durkheim obviously studied crime, so that's where it links in. And his perspective was that crime is good for a healthy society. It shows where the boundaries are, it shows what norms and values need to be considered and reconsidered, and it shows that society can identify itself through its laws and how it treats prisoners and that kind of idea essentially. So some of you had some strong ideas on that, and some of you felt that the idea of crime being good for society seemed really strange at first. So think about why that might be and what's changed over time. Something that used to be a figure of the death penalty, then becoming illegal, but only with a prison sentence, for example, followed by accepted society, shows a change in values, and you could link this to Durkheim's ideas. So the concept, the example we always talk about is homosexuality. Homosexuals were put to death. Homosexuals were put into prison, given hard labour, and then in the modern era, very recently, homosexuals have been subject to the equality laws and gay marriage and things like that from the Marriage Act. So we can see that change over time and see Durkheim's logic there. This week in year 10, we did a whole lesson looking at different types of schools and what the different types of schools are in the UK, what that means, the fact that so many are linked to the state in some way but have some features which make them unique and different. For example, grammar schools being selective and academic for the 11 plus, faith schools, as the name implies, selecting pupils based on faith, etc., and compared them to our own ideas around academies and comprehensives and looking at the changes and what that brings. We then moved on to arguments for and against private education. We talked about the impacts of league tables, exams, SATs, and how that could compare between a non-selective school such as an academy versus a grammar school or a private school, and what that meant, and the view of parents and pupils and teachers in society. We spent some time studying the 2 studies by Ball, the initial one where he looked at one school, and then the more collaborative one looking at further schools in the wider LEA and what that meant. And we talked about parental choice and competition in schools. We talked about the impact of Ofsted and league tables. We talked about how the methods of participant observation can give you some impact on observing behaviour in the classroom, but obviously it's the behaviour of the parents and the choice of the parents which really counts. And the fact that these schools were very different to each other and had very different pupils and different cohorts in them was really interesting. The big discussion though was around setting versus streaming and what that meant, and bringing out ideas of labelling and bringing out ideas of teachers subconsciously labelling and setting kids anyway. So was it better just to set children based on academic ability and live with that fact or not? And some of you had some really interesting ideas there. So think carefully about how you feel setting works and what it's good for. One of the big skills is using different ideas in your essays. So you could get an essay question on literally anything on the topic within your exam, and we see that all the time. So although you were taught about ball in the lesson, the key skill, and a lot of you did this really nicely, was to compare it to Willis and Bowles and Gintis, case studies like Summerhill School versus homeschooling, and the ideas around choice. So we went through and really recapped those very well, I felt. And the fact that feminist views on the spec aren't linked to one particular sociologist, but a general discussion around gender gaps in terms of attainment, the impact on the rest of people's lives, and gendered subjects particularly seems to be an area that you guys as a class talked about this year. And functionalists there we've got on the slide, Durkheim and Parsons, they're writing at a much earlier time than a lot of these other education theorists, so that might be something to consider when using their views and comparing them and measuring changes over time in values and outcomes, etc., etc. In year 11 we've looked at something which I feel is quite a hard concept to grasp at first because of the language used, but once you get it, it's fairly straightforward, and that's the affluent worker. So we debated this definition of the affluent worker according to the 7-class system study from the time, and how it had a rather narrow definition in some respects, although there's lots of factors there. The idea that they're 44-year-old people who are fairly well off in the middle of the class system, that was an interesting idea to us. And then we built that out and what that could mean. And we looked at all the lifestyle and attitude definitions that the new class classification gives people, and how that's moved on from just the job you do and the money you earn. We then spent this week picking apart 2 texts, one on Lockwood and Goldthorpe and the idea of embourgeoisement, and then defined study, revisiting that years later. So this functionalist idea of Lockwood's, that the working class are moving away from class solidarity and becoming more consumerist and accepting capitalism, that came about in the 1960s, and then Devine obviously revisited that later in the 80s, published the work in 1992. And interviews from Devine said that, yeah, there is some evidence of this rising privatized individualism and this obsession with buying stuff, essentially materialism, but it's a sideshow. It's not actually that big. Most working class people from the same demographic as which Lockwood studied still see themselves as working class. They still see privileged, wealthy elites and massive social inequality, and this idea of ascribed status still existing in society. There's not really a meritocracy. You're limited to within your own class, and that's basically it. And one way you can get away from that is by buying stuff. So I feel this week was particularly challenging, but a lot of you really impressed me with your effort and how you rose to that challenge. And I've marked some books so far and about to mark the others, and I've seen some excellent writing already. So use this ready for your mocks, because if you get a question on this, last year, and nationally as well, not just within our cohort, it seemed to be a question or a concept which, when it came up, confused students quite a lot. Whereas I felt you guys explained it really well, and you got the idea that class has moved away from just what you do and how much you earn, and it's about your lifestyle, your attitude, and how you see yourself. And you reflect on that and compare yourself to other people. So Devine obviously is a Marxist, and argue very strongly that Marx's ideas are still very relevant. What has changed, if anything, is very slight and not as important as the fact that Marx is still correct over 100 years after his death, well after the Industrial Revolution. I hope that's been useful. If you need anything for this week or for the upcoming assessments and mocks, leave me a question on the classroom, see me in school, or leave me a comment below. Thank you very much.